We read our sermon text earlier as our Old Testament reading, so we can get right into the sermon today. We're going to talk about the story of Rahab, a woman of faith and faithfulness. And there are a lot of traps we can fall into in terms of time sucks in this sermon, so I'm going to try to keep on the straight and narrow here. But to begin, I'll tell you a little bit of the dilemma of Rahab. So I was in a seminary class with a really fine teacher, very good teacher, who was he was my Genesis to Joshua teacher. So he was going through Exodus, and we got to Exodus 20, and he began to go through the Ten Commandments, and a penetrating, very clear analysis. It was wonderful all the way up until the ninth commandment, where he said the ninth commandment was, do not lie. And that's fine, I guess, but I just raised my hand and I said, well, it's not exactly, with all due respect, esteemed professor, that's not exactly what it says. He's like, well, do not bear false witness, but that's what it means, do not lie. Then when he went to the Rahab story and the Egyptian midwife stories, he proceeded to make the claim that the Egyptian midwives had sinned by lying, and that Rahab had also sinned by lying. And it didn't really sit well with me. But I wasn't going to combat my esteemed doctoral professor in a seminary class. I'm not there to teach, or I'm there to learn. So I just was trying to take into account what he was saying. And then I went and studied some more. And I am more convinced now than ever that there's a little more to it than that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Rahab story. It's going to mostly center on Joshua 2, but we're going to go to a few other places that are as necessary. But we're going to talk about Rahab's fiction, which we're all very familiar with, Rahab's faith, which for some reason gets short shrift in a lot of these discussions, and Rahab's future of Rahab. So let's begin by talking about Rahab's fiction. And this is in Joshua 2. And I'm not going to read the whole thing again. I'm pretty sure you guys know the story. But I want to reframe the story slightly because I don't think the story as I understood it. So when I was a kid, I loved this story. But I had this very cloak and dagger James Bond kind of idea of what the spies were about. Because I was putting my idea of spies, the James Bond idea, the lone, undercover dude, I was kind of projecting that onto this ancient reality. And if you think about the story in those terms, and you start thinking, practically speaking, what this means, the story doesn't really make as much sense. So I'll just go through and tell you some of the issues. If you take a cloak and dagger James Bond type idea of this story, you're thinking that the spies, let's call them spies for now, because they're not called messengers until later. They are called messengers, so we'll get to that. But the spies, they come at night, and somehow or another, these famously formidable walls, they are able to get over, because we know from the story that the gates are closed at night. And the whole city is in fear of the Israelites who are nearby camped, so they're not just going to leave the gates open for these spies to come in and out in the middle of the night. So that means that these formidable walls had to have been climbed then by the spies, who then, even though they have the parkour skills to do this, are able to get over this famously formidable wall, find their way to, I guess, the nearest lodging, and in that very night, now these are expert parkour James Bond type spies, apparently, that can get over these formidable walls, but in that very night, they're discovered. They're not only discovered as being there, they're also discovered as being Israelites, which means that all the way to the king of Jericho, a report goes on the very night that they showed up. That's a little weird. So what were they doing? Did they come into the place and be like, hey, we're spies from Israel, and we just wanted to spy the land out, right? I mean, they probably would have been trying to hide their identity, you'd think, if that's the way it went. But But somehow or another, they didn't hide their identity. They knew they were Israelites. They figured the whole thing out on the night that they got there, after they just climbed the walls. And before they could even go to sleep on that first night, Jericho's king has sent people to come and pick them up. And then you also have other questions like, why are they at a brothel? Like, what are they doing there? Like, why was that? Was it just like the first available place or something? Are these righteous men? Like, what are they doing? Okay, there's another option that I think makes a whole lot more sense. So go with me for a little bit, because, and this will matter. We'll get to it, it will be like, it will matter. What if they were messengers? Now, there's reason to believe this. First off, Joshua 6:17, and just so you don't think I'm making this up, I'm just going to go and read it to you. But in Joshua 6:17, Joshua himself speaks concerning these two men, and he says, "And the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent." He does not use the term spies. Now, he does call them spies even to his own men. So it's not like he's trying to hide this reality that they're actually spies. He calls them messengers in this text and in verse 25. They're also called messengers in James. When James talks about how she hid the messengers, these men are called messengers. Now, as soon as you have that key word messenger, you start to understand the story might be a little different than what we thought it was, because this was typical of ancient Near East. So James Bond solo, cloak and dagger type espionage, not typical of ancient Near East. What is typical of ancient Near East are messengers being sent as envoys, pretending to be messengers, while at the same time they are spying things out and checking things out. We actually see this in the Old Testament multiple places. You see this with the Babylonian envoy that were sent to Hezekiah. They were sent because Hezekiah had been sick. And so the Babylonian king says, "Hey, I'm just sending you my friends here with a gift just to see how you're doing," right? But the messengers end up searching out the entire land. This envoy of Babylon does. And Isaiah is very upset about it when he comes and is like, "Okay, Hezekiah, what did you show them?" "Everything." Right? "I showed them everything." "Oh, well, that was a bad idea. That was not a good idea." Eventually, Babylon is going to take everything that they saw. Hezekiah, we can talk about that at some other point, but he misinterprets that. Okay. There's another story, this one even more interesting because it's even more particular concerning suspicions of messengers. This is in 1 Chronicles 19. And again, I'm gonna turn there. I just don't want you to think that I'm making things up, because I do that. I mean, we're talking about Rahab, So, anyway. 1 Chronicles 19:1. So Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, died, and after this his son reigned in his place. And David, who's king at the time, said, "I will deal kindly with Hanun, the son of Nahash, for his father dealt kindly with me." So David sent messengers to console him concerning his father. And David's servants came to the land of the Ammonites to Hanun to console him. But the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun, and listen to this and see if you don't hear a hint here. "Do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father? Have not his servants come to you to search and to overthrow and to spy out the land?" So Hanun took David's servants and shaved them and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away, and they departed. And when David was told concerning the men, he sent messengers to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, "Remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return." Now, when the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, Hanun and the Ammonites sent 1,000 talents of silver to hire chariots and horsemen from Mesopotamia, from Aram-Maacah, and from Zobah. And they hired 32,000 chariots, and the king of Maacah with his army, who came and encamped before Medeba. And it continues. They get beat. But why did they go and hire military forces immediately after they sent these messengers away in shame? Because attacking messengers is an act of war. Messengers have diplomatic immunity. So whether or not they were there to spy out the land, you're not going to be able to treat these messengers badly without the king who sent them. And this is really important. In Hebrew, the word for king is melech. The word for messenger is malach. And a lot of people think it's because the messenger, could be ambassador, is a representative of the king, usually. And so he has this sort of like, I come in the name of the king. How you treat me, that's how you're treating the king. And so messengers weren't supposed to be treated badly. They were supposed to be treated well. And whether or not they had little secret things going on in the background, if you didn't know that for sure, you had to be careful. And even if you did know that for sure, if you treated messengers badly, the reality was that was an act of war. Whatever may have been the case before then, you're now at war. So I was thinking maybe that's what was going on in the Joshua story. As I'm looking, this is the ancient Near Eastern context. This makes sense. It actually makes sense of a huge number of things in the story. That they weren't sent, they were sent through the gates as normal, as messengers from Joshua to Jericho. They would have been housed at the farthest extent of the city in Jericho. And this is the reason why. You want them away from the major complexes, the king's palace and other things like that, in the center of the city. So you put them nearby the wall on the outside. And you would keep them at a place. You would always keep ambassadors, we still do this, at fine hotel-type establishments where you can wine them and dine them and maybe dull their minds with other pleasures so that when they finally do show up, they will have been treated so well that they're amenable to whatever your ends or aims may be. This was really common. So you'd think, if that were the case, the messengers came from Joshua to Jericho. The king of Jericho received them, placed them at a famous brothel nearby on the walls of the city where they could be out of the way so that they can, have a good time for a day or two before they show up in front of the king for an audience. That actually makes a lot of sense. But then, in the night, the king of Jericho's men come to him and say, hey, I don't think those guys are on the up and up. I don't think they're really messengers. I think they're actually spies, which is accurate. But they didn't know that, right? They didn't have any reason to know that. And so they go and they send their guys, their messengers, to Rahab and say, hey, those men, remember those men that we placed here? The men from Israel? They're actually here to spy out the land, so we're going to take them now. She hides them. At this point in the story, you don't know why. Why? What loyalty or what reason would she have for hiding the spies at this point in the story? We don't know. We don't know. Okay, so real quickly, before I go on to the next section, which is Rahab's faith, because we do find out why she does it. Let me just go through a couple of things that you may be looking through the text and saying, well, there's a couple of things that don't make sense. I did the same thing with my messenger theory. And if you want to talk about it more later, I would be happy to. What's very interesting is I said, okay, that thing, this feature, this word, this phrase, these kinds of things. And I'll give you an example. For instance, when they come to Rahab, Rahab says, I did not know where they came from. Now, that would indicate, right, that she wouldn't have lied like that. I mean, unless she was not very smart. Because if they had sent those ambassadors to her place and everybody knew it, she's not going to say, I don't know where they came from, because she did know where they came from. She was, the one who was hired to house them, right? If my messenger theory is correct. So I'm like, oh, okay, well, that kind of knocks that out. Except for that detail and a number of other details when you look in the Septuagint. Now, do you know the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It was completed about the 4th century BCE. It's in Greek, it's not in Hebrew, but it was based on a Hebrew manuscript. And so especially with these first 6 books, we can be pretty sure that it is a good and faithful witness. And sometimes we prefer the Septuagint witness over the Hebrew witness, because our Hebrew text that we have is called the Masoretic text, the MT. It is actually a later document. It's a complete document, but it's from about the 6th or 7th century AD. So we're talking about, a good hundreds of years as far as the witness is concerned. So sometimes, if you're talking about text variations, Sometimes you'll go with the Septuagint, sometimes you'll go with the Masoretic. What's really interesting is that in the Septuagint, every single feature that I'm talking about is removed. It's not in there. It's not in that manuscript. So this is my theory, that well-meaning scribes, later on in the history of the biblical transmission, in order to fill in details, filled in details to make more sense with their context of espionage, without really taking into account the ancient context of espionage, which is actually connected to this messenger double agent thing. So that's my theory. Why is this important? I'll tell you why it's important. Because a lot of times when we're looking at the story, it doesn't really make any sense in terms of Rahab's commitments or loyalties to her own place, right? You might look at this and say, Rahab has totally betrayed Jericho by doing this. But if in fact she was actually hired by the king of Jericho to treat these diplomats well and to cover them diplomatic immunity, handing them over as an act of war would actually be in contradiction to the benefit and value of Jericho and against her reputation. Not Rahab's reputation, the reputation of Jericho, the king of Jericho. They took these messengers that should have had diplomatic immunity, and they treated them very badly, and that's an act of aggression and an act of war. So in that sense, it kind of frees her, I think, from that betrayal. But nonetheless, let's move on, because we got to find out why she hid them in the first place. And honestly, when you read, and I don't know if when you were just hearing this in Joshua 2, when you read her words, they are so beautiful. When you think about the fact that she is a Canaanite woman who has been raised in Canaanite religion in a horrible place. Like, the religion of Canaan and the acts of Canaan thankfully have mostly been destroyed and lost to history, because what tiny fragments of Canaanite religion we still do find every once in a while speak only to the horror and dehumanizing violence and cruelty of a place that was completely immured in just degeneration. So you think this woman who, it's not like there's any hiding what she is, right? I mean, the prostitute, Rahab, she is called that. She's not just called that now, she's called that in the New Testament, right? Rahab the harlot. Wouldn't you love to have become a believer? You get married, you're married to Salmon, you have your son Boaz, and everyone's still calling you Rahab the harlot. It's like, that was a long time ago. I'm not that person anymore. But yeah, so there's no hiding the fact that Rahab was not, at least for her life, a good person. She was an immoral woman, immured in this world of Canaan that was also totally immoral and degenerate. And yet, in the midst of that, she hears a report of the realities of God and is completely convinced. Do you see it? It's so amazing. I mean, it boggles the mind. The statement that she makes, the confession of faith that she makes in Joshua 2, is as good a statement of faith as anybody. I mean, she says, I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard all the things, how the Lord dried up the Red Sea, how you destroyed Sihon and Og, and the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan. We have heard all these things, and we are terrified. Not I am terrified, we. She's saying everybody knows this. We're all scared. We're all melting away with fear. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. Now, but look at this. There was no spirit left in any man because of you, for Yahweh, your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. That is as good a statement of faith as anybody in the Old Testament ever makes. God is God. Your God, he is actually the God of heaven and earth. All the gods we've been serving, not real. Fake. Fake news. Not going along with that anymore. And so, recognizing that that's the case, see, if that is actually the case, that Jericho is not going to stand, what do you think that Rahab was hoping for with the receiving of these messengers? That there would be a peace. That the people of Jericho would make a peace. She knows they can't stand. She's aware of it. Not only is she aware of it, they are also aware of it. According to her, they all know that no one is going to stand against God and the Israelites. So she's thinking, hallelujah, we're taking in these messengers, we'll get a peace, and we will be secure. We'll be safe. But now this king of Jericho, he is calling these messengers away from me, and he's going to do them harm. I'm going to hide them, because my peace with the people of Jericho, that's apparently not going to happen. Because even though they know what I know, they're not going to act on it. And so I'm making a separate peace for me and my family and my household. And what's very interesting about all of this is it's framed in terms of a pledge of truth, which again, especially if you're talking about, like, was Rahab a liar? The fact that she frames this whole thing, and again, it's not as clear in the English sometimes, but she does say to give me a solemn pledge. But in the Hebrew, it's actually a pledge of truth, a covenant of truth. And she actually says, as I have dealt, and it says kindly with you, deal kindly with me. The word there for kindly is chesed, which you may know. It is all throughout the scriptures, and it's usually translated covenant faithfulness or steadfast love, because it is love based on a covenant. Now again, this makes sense. This makes sense. I have not broken diplomatic immunity with you. I have treated you the way I was supposed to treat you, even though this king of Jericho and the rest of his minions are trying to hurt you. Against the covenant, the agreement, the diplomatic agreement that we would have had, I'm actually holding to it. Now you deal faithfully with me by sparing me as I have spared you. Again, this is contractual language. And we're going to base this on a pledge of truth. I promise, you promise, we're going to follow through. And they say, as long as you act faithfully, we will act faithfully. Meaning, as long as you follow through on what you've said you're going to do, we will follow through on what we've said we're going to do. Now, again, all of that based on covenant, contract, promise, truth. Very interesting, again, that's Rahab's play, especially, again, when she is famous for being a liar, right? It's like, why would they think that they could trust her, right? Okay. I'm going to get around to it eventually, the question you're all asking, I hope. But first, let's talk a little bit about truth and faithfulness. And this is important. Truth and faithfulness in the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, are deeply connected. There isn't actually a different word for faith than faithfulness, either in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. So it's up to translators, because English has different meanings, faithfulness and faith. And so we have to make choices. Translators make choices. They see the word in Greek, pistis, and they say, do I translate this faith? Do I translate this faithfulness? Kind of just depends on the context as to which is in view. And the same as in the Old Testament when you see the Hebrew emunah, which also means faith or faithfulness. So for instance, when God says he saw the faith of Abraham, Abraham believed and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, that's the same word, emunah. So you say, in that case, it's obviously belief, because what did Abraham have to be faithful about? All he had to do is say, sure, I believe you. Right? That's all that he had to do when God originally gave him the promise in Genesis 15. Okay, so there's not two different words. So that's a kind of our construct. It's an English thing. It's a modern thing. Okay? That's actually really important, because even in Hebrews, when you're talking about hall of faith, we tend to think of hall of faith as being a hall of belief, But the hall of faith in the New Testament could easily be translated hall of faithfulness. That a group of people who were faithful, full of faith. And this connection is actually made very clear here in this story because, again, Rahab knew the truth and she acted on it. Her faith was a living faith. It wasn't just that she said, yeah, God is obviously the God of heaven and earth. Your God is obviously the God of heaven and earth. And we all know that no one can stand against him. And I'm just letting that flit around in my brain. I'm not going to do anything about it. Instead, she said, given that fact, given that truth, I need to be actively protecting what I can because I know that no one will stand against you. And notice, Hebrews makes this very, very clear. If you turn to Hebrews 11:31, this is in the Hall of Faith passage, and you'll miss it potentially. But if you linger on it for a bit, you start going, I wonder what that could mean particularly. What is he talking about particularly? So let's look at this. Hebrews 11:31 says, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Do you notice? Perish with those who were disobedient. Who is that talking about? He's talking about the other Jerichoans, right? The other denizens of Jericho and the king, and maybe even the other Canaanites who perished. But in what way were they disobedient? So it's made a little clearer when you see that in the Greek, the word for disobedient is not faithful. It's perfectly valid to translate it disobedient in the same way that it's perfectly valid to translate pistis as faithfulness. This is the opposite. You know how atheist means not God, does not believe in God because a is like the negation. Well, this is that word but with pistis. It's like apistis, apatheo, that not believing, not faithful. So really what it says is by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were not faithful. She was faithful. They were not faithful. They did not believe. But it's not that we know that they did know, right? I mean, she said they did. She said, we all know this. So it wasn't that there was no head knowledge. It's that they didn't put into practice what they knew to be the case. And in fact, you see this throughout Canaan. And it's a really interesting reality that I didn't even really think about very much until I started studying Joshua with the kids, and they started asking terrible questions about, why did God order the entire people of Canaan, to be destroyed? And it's kind of like, it's a harsh thing, right? But I want you to look at Joshua 11. This doesn't necessarily lessen the harshness, but it does give an explanation for it. In Joshua 11:19, this is in the midst of Joshua basically just completely destroying and setting to complete destruction city after city, king after king in Canaan. And this is after the story of the Gibeonites, which we'll get to in a second. But there was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle. Now look at this. This is Joshua 11, verse 20. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle in order that they should be devoted to destruction and should receive no mercy but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. So you can see this. Remember the Hivites, the Gibeonites? Do you guys remember the story of the Gibeonites? I'll tell you in case you're wondering. It's a hilarious story. It's after the story of Jericho. Jericho is miraculously and utterly destroyed, aside from Rahab. Rahab has put the scarlet cord in her window, and she and her whole household are saved. And she alone is saved of all Jericho. Now, the Gibeonites are another city in Canaan, and they're actually a fairly powerful city. We find out later. But their rulers, their leaders, come up with a plan. where they're saying, we also know that we're not going to stand before the Israelites. And after seeing what happened with Jericho, we're positive. They destroyed Jericho, this formidable city, with music. So I don't know what's happening, but I can tell you that bad things are coming. Like, they didn't even have to fight to break through the walls of Jericho. They just chanted and blew horns and stuff. Very scary, terrifying, don't want to mess with that. So all the leaders, they come up with a plan. They say, we're going to get a bunch of traveling gear, and we're going to beat it and get it all dry and dusty and rake it through the dirt, and age it up, maybe put some coffee stains on it. We're going to really get it all dirty and grungy and dingy and dusty, and we're not going to clean our clothes or wash our face or anoint our heads with oil or anything like that. We're going to be dusty, ashy, dirty, like we've just been on a 500-mile journey, and we're going to show up in the camp of the Israelites. Oh, tired, all of our wineskins and water skins are dry and empty, and we've got nothing because we've been traveling so many miles. They came from around the corner, right? But they've been traveling hundreds of miles to get here. And so they show up and they say, but we've heard, international renown of your greatness. And so we're wondering if maybe we could have a treaty with you and make peace. We're not from around here, right? And Joshua and the rest of the Israelites, I'm not really sure why. They don't really investigate very much. I guess the subterfuge is effective, and they say, sure, yeah, let's have a treaty. And then God, immediately after they've already struck the treaty, God immediately was like, oh, you fools. These are the Gibeonites. They're just down the street. You're supposed to be taking them out. But since you made a covenant with them, I guess they're going to be spared. And they were. They weren't just spared at that time either. If you remember, God was very, very, very concerned that the Gibeonites be protected by the Israelites forever. Because even way, way later in the time of Saul got really upset with some of the Gibeonites and killed some of them. And then after Saul wasn't even king anymore, David is king. Bad things start happening, and they're losing some battles and stuff like that. And David inquires of the Lord and says, what's going on? And God says, it's because Saul killed some Gibeonites. We're not supposed to do that, because of the covenant with Joshua. Okay, so God took that covenant very, very seriously. And David had to make it right by offering some of the descendants of Saul, it was 70 to the Gibeonites. They were kind of bloodthirsty. They were still Canaanites, but they were protected. They were spared. And I want you to notice something, because this is very interesting. When you hear about the Gibeonites and they show up in Joshua 9, with this subterfuge, because you would say that this is a subterfuge pretty similar to Rahab's subterfuge, wouldn't you say? The fact that they're speaking in contradiction to the facts. They didn't really travel hundreds of miles to get there. They're not actually from a distant land. They are speaking contrary to the facts. But notice in Joshua 9, verse 4, it has one word. It's a very curious word that I just want to point out, and that is this word, also, which we usually skip over, but look at this. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took, okay, sorry, I'm used to the New American Standard. This is the ESV, which is you guys use. They on their part, is the Hebrew gam, which should be translated also. They also acted with cunning. Now, they're trying to translate in the ESV on their part, because they're trying to make sense of this word gam in the Hebrew, which means usually also. But you can think, well, that's kind of weird, and you can understand why the translators would say, okay, let's just translate it on their part, because when you say they also, you go, who else are you talking about, right? I mean, it refers to somebody else. They also acted shrewdly. Who's the other person that acted shrewdly like they did? There's only one other possible candidate. It's Rahab. They acted like Rahab. They used cunning, shrewdness, subterfuge, even trickery, try and get their way into a peace with Israel, because they knew they wouldn't be able to stand against God. So that is the faith that we have here. in some sense, this is faithful on the part of the Gibeonites, in the sense that what they believe to be true concerning God, they actually act on. They actually make it so. That's important. It's a very important reality. Okay. And what we have now then to talk about is Rahab's future, the future of Rahab. She is spared, she is saved, along with her household, but that's not all. She also becomes just a very important person in the history of the Bible. She is the great-great-grandmother of David. She is the great-great-grandmother of David. Rahab is. And she is the mother of Boaz. And she and Ruth, the wife of Boaz, both are two of the only women, two of three women who are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Now think about this. This woman who is a famous prostitute, known as a prostitute, she is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, a Canaanite woman who is in the genealogy of Jesus, a great-great-grandmother of David. She is also included in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews. We read some of that. But she is included as a faithful person, a person who believed God and acted on that belief faithfully and followed through. And again, when you understand that faithful and true are deeply connected, and in fact, I can prove it to you. When you hear something that is true, maybe in a sermon or something like that, or anywhere, we say, or when we're ending a prayer, we say Amen. Correct? Okay, so Amen is sort of a Aramaicism. It means faithful. That's what it means. It means trustworthy. This is faithful. This is trustworthy. It's from the root aman, which means to believe. And that the word for faith in the Old Testament is emunah, amena, right? It is from the same root. The word for truth is also from that same root, emet, in the Hebrew. So what you see then is that faithfulness and truth, in fact, if you look through if you have a literal translation or close to a literal translation, and they will occasionally tell you when they've translated something truth, they'll occasionally tell you could be faithfulness, or vice versa. Sometimes they'll translate faithfulness, and they'll say could be truth. Because what is true is what is faithful. So I would say that Rahab is not a liar. And I'm just going to skate the whole issue by saying that she is called faithful. And in that sense, she was true. And that's what's really important about the story. She was called faithful in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. She followed through on what she knew to be true of God, and she is rewarded and blessed for it in the history of Jesus, as a great-great-grandmother of David, as an important figure in the history of our life of salvation. So I would never, she's already called a harlot, so I'm not going to call her a liar too. But in conclusion, I would say there's a few things. God can and will save whomever he wishes, right? Rahab is a harlot in Canaan. God saved her. God pierced through the hardness of heart that all of her contemporaries, pretty much without exception, had, where all of them knew the same thing she knew, and they hardened their hearts against God, and they resisted God and were destroyed. She was saved because she was tender to the truth and followed through on it. And I will say that, leading from that, a faith of the head is a faith that is dead. If your faith is only entirely in here, it's no better than the kings and denizens of Jericho who perished. They also knew, as James says, the demons also know. They shudder in fear. Their hearts are melting away. They know they cannot stand against God, and yet they still, in their hardness, resist and fight. And the knowledge they have concerning God does not change that. So it's important for us to understand we must be like Rahab in this. Don't know something and not do anything about it. If you know the truth, do it. Do it like she did. And it takes a risk to do that. It takes a risk. Faith, operating in faith, is risky. Again, we don't really think about this, but Rahab took a huge risk doing what she did. If she had been found out, if she wasn't right, what if she wasn't right? What if the Israelites and God are all just, smoke and mirrors? Turns out Jericho can hold up against them. Well, what happens to her if it's found out? So she took her life in her hands because she knew it was true. And in the same way, we have to do that same thing. We have to walk in faith. We can't walk in sight. And to walk in faith, you have to act according to things that you believe to be true before God because he has told you on his word, and you're open to it, and you follow through on it. Kingdom of heaven is like a field, and in it is buried all sorts of treasure. And a man, hearing about it, sells everything he has, goes and buys that field for the treasure he believes is in it. Now, he can't figure out whether or not the treasure is in there before he's bought the field, before he's already sold out. And in the same way, that same risk, Rahab had to sell herself out entirely on this being true. And if it wasn't true, she was doomed. And that's the case for us too. We go ahead, let's not have our feet in two situations here and think that we can both believe God and not believe God at the same time. You can't, right? Like, if it's true, be sold out. Be willing to give whatever it takes for it. If it's not true, then reject it, right? Right? Like, do we want to hold on to something that's not true? No. So, if we believe it's true, do we believe this is true? Do we believe in Jesus? All right. So what is it not? What should we withhold then from following through on that truth being the case? Nothing. All right, let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your faithfulness to us, that you are faithful. You are eternally faithful. Your faithfulness is everlasting. Your truth is everlasting. Your love to your people that you have promised, you will complete, you will fulfill. We thank you that you have granted to us faith in Jesus Christ and that you have given your Holy Spirit, that we in him can live and can breathe, that we can know the things that we believe are true. Father, as we have more and more invested, as we've taken the risks necessary to follow after you, we have found you more and more true. We have found you more and more everything that you promised you would be. Your promises are sure, and your warnings also always come to pass. Help us, Lord Jesus, through your Spirit. In your name, amen.